Hello my fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. I felt like doing something a little different today and cover the top placing Votann list from the WTC event which recently happened, in addition to another list that had my attention early on when the initial lists were first revealed. But before we jump in, I want to quickly thank our channel members Jordan Stuckenschneider and Saturn ASMR, two of our very most noble of kin. So a massive thank you for supporting the channel and helping us grow. If you're interested in becoming a channel member yourself and helping me bring you more content, please consider joining today using the link down in the description below. On today's agenda, we'll take a look at the WTC World Team Championship. We'll do a little breakdown as to what the event actually is for those of you who don't know. Then we'll quickly talk about the WTC Votann meta. We'll of course take a look at the top placing Votann list at the event, and then I also want to cover one of the interesting lists that caught my attention very early on and was curious to follow and see where it ended up placing. But before we go any further, I want to quickly announce that today's video is proudly sponsored by Card Brawlers, a local gaming store in my hometown that I love and cherish, located in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Card Brawlers has some incredibly competitive pricing, some of the best I've ever seen for Warhammer products, a fantastic inventory, and offer both domestic and international shipping on all of your goods. If you're interested in checking out the store, please consider using my affiliate link in the video description below to help support my plastic addiction at no added cost. Alright, so what is the WTC event? Well, the WTC event stands for the World Team Championship. It's the biggest teams event in the world, 8-person teams, 4-day long event, and has players from nations worldwide. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like the mini Olympics, but for Warhammer teams events. There's no duplicate factions per team, which is a really important point to keep in mind when we look at team events in general, so this is something to consider as we go through these lists. Alright, now for the Votann meta at WTC and the role we typically play in teams events. Out of 320 players at the event, Votann represented 13 of these players. Typically, the role of Votann in a team-based event is to play the role of a stalemate opponent. You're basically going into these games against armies other people might not want to play against or will have a difficult matchup into, and you yourself are able to get a pretty even score, or at the very worst, make sure your opponent doesn't get too much of a lead, which would contribute to a wider disparity inside of your team score overall. I have a great interview on the channel with Jordan Stuckenschneider, who goes into extreme detail as to how to play Votann properly at teams events and what you can expect to get out of the faction as a whole. Ultimately, Votann's here to help keep the score tight. So, while I was getting ready to make this video, I noticed something very interesting in a lot of the Votann list design choices ran at this event. And that is that there are some pretty explicit patterns that we see in terms of both units and unit counts that the players were running in their lists. I aggregated some of the numbers here for you on the screen. It's super basic, but basically 10 out of 13 players, or 77% of the list that had Votann, ran exactly 4 Sagittars. So no more, no less, exactly 4 Sagittars, 77% of the lists. 92% of the lists ran at least 2 Berserks. So that is basically every single list had at least 2 Berserks inside. Only 1 out of 13 lists had a triple Landford, and then 92% of the list ran Jaegers, as we all already know are a fantastic unit for our army. I then have 30% running 2 times Warriors, so exactly 2 times Warrior units were included in only 30% of the list, and this was really surprising to me. I generally am under the impression that you want to start a list off with 2 squads of Warriors inside. They play a very good role of being that secondary activation inside of your Sagittar, either for playing primary or for just denying primary on your opponent, where you could throw units out from behind a wall inside of a Sagittar. So kind of filling the role as you would see typically with other armies, using legionaries, for example, outside of a Rhino. Basically just throwing these out to either move block or to just stand on an objective and deny primary points, being OC2, and making use of those Sagittars. So I was pretty surprised to only see 2 Warriors run inside of most of these lists, but I do believe that is because we have so much of a heavy inclusion on Berserks, where 92% of the lists are running at least 2 squads of Berserks, and in a lot of ways I think the Berserk unit acts as a dual purpose activation. You can use it as mission play, and you can also use it as a trading piece. So they're basically like Warriors that have melee weapons, which is pretty cool. As I was making this slide, I also had an idea to maybe for some future content, maybe test an aggregated WTC list. So just run all of these lists through an analysis and pick the standout top quadrant, so anything above 75% in terms of what was ran, and then just build a list off of that just to test it out and see what it would look like. I think that could be pretty fun, so if there's an opportunity for that, I'll definitely try to explore it and showcase it to you guys. Now, talking about this meta and what we see with the list design in terms of patterns, I think it's pretty interesting because we know going into this the role that Votann is trying to fill inside of a team environment. And because of that, it makes a lot of sense that the decisions people are going to make when they're designing their list, being the units they're including and the number of units they're including, are going to reflect some of those decisions. And so when we consider that a lot of these players are higher end players, top of the competitive ladder, it makes sense that they'll come to kind of the same conclusions when they look at these units and decide how many activations they want in a list, or how many of a certain type, or how much of a role they want to commit their list to. So I thought this was pretty cool looking at it as a whole and just seeing that so many parallels can be drawn between all of these lists. Now, in terms of the top placing WTC Votann list, coming in 19th place out of 320 players, taking home a 6-win, 0-draw, and 1-loss score, we have William Fuhrmann from Team Switzerland. Now, these matchups included a victory of 20-0 against Necrons, 20-0 against World Eaters, 11-9 against Adeptus Sororitas, so a very close game, and honestly a matchup that's pretty tough, I think, for Votann. We then have Votann at 20 to Eldari at 0, very impressive. We have Votann at 13 to Tyranids at 7, a very narrow defeat of Votann 8 versus Guard at 12, and then Votann 12 versus Adeptus Sororita again at 8. Now, in terms of the list itself, I do think it's actually pretty interesting. This was one that I also had on my radar, so I'm happy it plays pretty high as we get to talk about it in today's video. So kicking off the list, we have an Ioneer champion. This guy is not running any enhancements at all to my surprise, which is why I thought it was pretty interesting. So no Appraising Glare, no Grim Demeanor, just nothing. Just a regular E-champ who's running a Mass Hammer and Weaver Field. Of course, this E-champ is going to be accompanying a big 10-man brick of Ioneer Hearthguard, which I think we're starting to see a little bit less of, but I'm happy to see them make an appearance here in the list. This unit is running one Hesir with a hammer and the Teleport Crest, of course, coming in from Deep Strike, and the rest of the gang is all equipped with Vulcanites and the Concussion Gauntlets. Just a very solid hammer unit, tough to shift as well once it lands down, and is pretty good at contesting the primary objective in the middle of the table. We then have 2 squads of 10 Hearthkin Warriors. Nothing crazy about these guys. They're running the L7 missiles and the Magna. I will say it's quite interesting that one of the few lists that were running 2 squads of Warriors happened to place the highest, so I do think perhaps there is something to explore here, being that number of activations that you have, the number of bodies you could throw onto objectives or utilize for redundancies in terms of losing your transport, popping out, and still contesting an objective with 10 OC. Next up, we have 2 squads of 5 Berserks. These are all running Mauls with a Mole Grenade Launcher, so again, keeping in line with that pattern of having at least 2 squads of Berserks. All of this, of course, is running inside of a Sagittar each, so splitting the Warriors up and the Berserks inside of 4 Sagittars. And all of these are running the High Las Casino Gun. I don't think there's anything wrong with running the High Las. I know some people tend to prefer running the longer range missile launcher. It's fair. I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. Personally, I'm leaning on the fence towards the High Las just because it could potentially pop off. You're not really relying on this unit for damage, but it's good to have that threat that your opponent has to somewhat respect, because in most cases you'll be wounding things on 2 if they're double judged. It also means you have a significant amount of speed here, being able to scout effectively 4 units right out of the gate, each one containing a second activation within itself. So a pretty powerful board presence here, and just readily available to get any kind of secondaries you might draw turn 1, and of course ready to contest any objectives you might want to go to as well. In a very similar vein, we're running 3 squads of Pioneers. So in total, we're running 15 bikes in this list, so less than 18, but of course more than 9. And what this leads to is having 2 quasi-hammer units with the 6-man bikes. These are going to be running up your flanks, and then you're going to have the 3-man Pioneer squad, who I assume is going to just kind of be sitting in the back early game, screening and then ready to pop up and down if they have to go get behind enemy lines or engage on all fronts and act as your throwaway. We then have the newest unit in our roster here, a squad of 10 Jaegers running the APM and a sniper, and the rest of the gang has pistols and knives. This is a very powerful unit for those of you that have been fortunate enough to acquire some. I think we can all agree that the utility that this unit has provided the army with is pretty significant. You definitely feel an impact either being able to just literally make a line down the middle of the table, a bow tie, and block people from either infiltrating or stopping your scout moves, or just being able to forward deploy them super aggressively and trying to turn one, tie something up, using your reactive move to try to do some shenanigans like either popping back behind cover or popping forward if you roll high enough and trying to maybe tie the movement or block something from getting into a firing lane. So very strong unit, especially in a list like this where we're actually running 7 different scouting activations. We want to make sure that we can get our pieces where they need to get to, and a 10-man squad of infiltrators helps to ensure this, especially if we get to deploy first. The final unit included in this list is a Hecaton Land Fortress, and I think this is a really interesting selection of a unit to include in this archetype. We don't typically see Land Forts included in lists that are running a heavy selection of Pioneer bikes. Usually you get the 5 or 6 Sagittars and the massive squads of Pioneers, and this acts as the bulk of your point investment, and then the rest of the time you're just kind of filling these things up with different activations, running 3 squads of Berserks, and maybe a couple squads of 10-man Hearthguard bricks. So I do think it's interesting to see a Land Fortress come in here. It's kind of playing a similar role as the Hearthguard are in this case, but I do think it provides some extra value, because in a lot of ways, you now have access to using your 2x6 bike hammers playing on the flanks, while your Land Fort can contest the center or the side objectives through some firing lanes and really demand your opponent to put something respectable out in the open to deal with it. Meanwhile, your Sagittars and the cargo inside, consisting of Berserks and Warriors, gives you effectively 10 activations that you can use for secondaries, supporting the smaller 3-man bike squad who can fetch you engage or behind enemy lines later in the game. So I do think it has a very solid role in this list. It's empty, but that doesn't matter. It's still a Land Fortress at the end of the day. It does demand some respect from your opponent to take it down, especially with access to Armor Contempt if you haven't pulled your Hearthguard down yet, meaning that for them to deal with a Land Fort that's parking on an objective, they have to pull something out. And when they do, you have the tools to very aggressively and quickly respond to that threat. So overall, I really like the list. I think it's pretty unique. It kind of strikes a compromise between what I tend to run for my playstyle and what I think a lot of people have become accustomed to seeing in the competitive scene, being the large amounts of Sagittars, large squads of bikes, and just like filling them all up with activations. I think this makes for a little bit more of an interesting playstyle because you get a little bit of both worlds. And in a lot of ways, you don't necessarily compromise durability for number of activations and speed because you still have some pretty durable anvil units that are just going to kind of sit there and act as a threat on an objective, like the Hearthguard squad and the Hecaton Land Fortress. So a pretty cool list, and I do think in the context of Votann and Team's events, we can clearly see why it did so well. I know it's something a little bit rarer seeing 4 Sagittars accompanied by a Land Fortress, so what do you guys think about this combination? Let me know in the comments below. Alright, so this next list is the honorable mention. I was talking with one of our channel members, Jordan, when the WTC lists were first published, and this was one in particular that caught both of our attention, so I figured I would include it in today's video. The list was piloted by Alex Harrison from Team England and came 51st out of 320 players, which funny enough actually makes it the second highest placing Votann list from the event after the one we just previously covered. So Jordan, I guess we were onto something here. The list was piloted by Alex Harrison from none other than Team England. And again, 51st out of 320 players, taking home a 5-win, 1-draw, 1-loss streak, coming in second for Votann in terms of faction placings at this event. The matchups included Votann at 19 to CSM at 1, Votann 11 versus Votann Mirror matchup at 9, Votann 11 versus Necrons at 9, Votann 0 versus Black Templars at 20, and of course this was the infamous Black Templars list that was running 100 Crusaders or something crazy like that. So not a lot of lists have the firepower to deal with that, which I think will come into play when we take a look at the list in the next slide. We then have Votann at 11 versus Votann at 9, another mirror matchup here for Votann. We then have Votann draw 10-10 against Tau, And then lastly, a victory of 13-7 against Grey Knights for Alex. Now, right out of the gate here, just looking at these scores, these are the numbers we would expect to see with that philosophy of Votann's role in teams events in mind. We're looking for small victories here and very tight scores so that the disparity between a loss is minimized in case somebody else had to play into an unfavorable matchup. So again, we're really just looking to keep the scores as even as possible, and if this was the goal, which I suspect it was for Alex's Votann in this event, I think he succeeded. Alright, shifting gears and taking a look at the list, right out the gate we have a Broke Your Iron Master as the only character in this list. So already you're seeing why Jordan and I thought this was an interesting list to look at. Again, no enhancement here, which is very strange as well. You would expect to see Appraising Glare taken, as you do get some added benefits comboing with your units being able to just amplify their damage coming into targets that are sitting on an objective. Worth mentioning early on that the Broke Your Iron Master is actually not accompanying any Thunderkin today. He is just a lone character. We then have 2 squads of 10 Hearthkin Warriors. So these guys are running a slightly different loadout, being the High-Las Rifle and the High-Las Rotary Cannon. And I will mention again that I do think it's interesting that the top 2 placing lists, making up 50% of the lists that ran 2 Warriors at this event, as there were only 4 players that did so, ended up coming highest in terms of placing. I do think that having the inclusion of 20 Warriors in any Votann list is a tremendous benefit. It just gives you some extra redundancy for mission play. You have bodies that you can throw out of Sagittars, you have more activations, you have more board presence, and it's effectively the cheapest unit you could get, coming in at 50 points once you split them in half. So I do think having 2 squads of 10 is a staple. It's been a staple in all of my list designs, and it seems to be what the top end lists are having success with as well. We then have 3 squads of Berserks. These are all running the identical loadout of Mauls and a grenade launcher, and of course all of this is going to be sitting inside of Sagittars. Now we do have an interesting situation here, as there are only 4 Sagittars included in this list. So again, following that trend of 4 Sagittars. Now when we consider that we actually have 6 potential activations to put inside of each of these transports, and there's only capacity for 4, we need to keep in mind that we're going to have a couple people that won't be able to ride inside of a Sagittar. I think this is where things get a little bit interesting and why this is a standout list in my opinion, and that's the inclusion of 2 Hecaton land fortresses. Now I'm really not sure how the splitting ratio went, if we are putting any Berserks inside of a land fortress for a party bus, or if we're opting to put all 3 of the Berserks inside of a Sagittar, or perhaps leaving some of them disembarked and just throwing them into Sagittars after the first load of cargo disembarks. But I do think it's interesting that you have a lot of potential play by either putting things inside of land forts to split up your damage and having trading pieces that not necessarily will benefit from rerolling wounds to shoot, because obviously Berserks can't shoot, but just being able to transport Berserks somewhere reliably and get them into a vulnerable position without having to fear losing the vehicle that they're being transported in. Because obviously it takes a ton of firepower to take down a land fortress. And so if you can mimic that redundancy, as you see with the Sagittars, by having something inside of a land fortress as well, well, great. Now you have more trading pieces on that objective. Again, I'm not entirely sure what the split was. Maybe Berserks didn't ride inside of the land fortresses at all and they were just empty, and the Berserks went inside Sagittars, whereas the Warriors stayed on the board. It's totally valid, so I would be extremely curious to hear how the pilot ended up deploying his list. The next thing that we have is the inclusion of 2x6 Pioneer squads. So again, we have this big, quick hammer unit, as we saw with the previous list that was running 2 squads of 6 as well. Of course, this is replacing the role of the Hearthguard. We have a more effective damage output unit. It's faster. The shots are a little bit more impactful, containing some AP and ignoring cover. So you do get some value out of this. And again, it does follow that trend of archetypes shifting more towards in favor of having larger squads of bikes instead of sturdier but slower Hearthguard units. Interestingly, we're not running any small squads of 3, so we just have the 2 big bricks of 6, meaning that we have a little bit less mission play in terms of throwing a 3-man unit out to either stay on an objective and die to deny primary points, or potentially just going up and down and trying to score you behind enemy lines or engage on all fronts, or trying to get a tighter, smaller angle. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing because, as we'll see in just a moment, we have the inclusion of 2 squads of 10 Jaegers. So for those of you who haven't been able to find a box yet, you know where your squad went. Alex is running 2 of them at the WTC event, and we see here that this allows for a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you actually utilize your infiltrating unit. You can still deploy them in a large bow-tied line down the middle, as we saw with the previous list, just denying your opponent that ability to be able to get scout moves off themselves, or denying your scout moves by infiltrating closer to you. And ultimately what this gives you is a little bit more flexibility because you get a second squad as well that you can use to either play towards a mission goal, like maybe hiding behind ruins inside of your natural expansion objective, forcing your opponent to come out and play, or being very aggressive in how you deploy this, so you have 2 units that are running into your opponent's lines to try to slow them down a turn or 2 from getting onto primary. All in all, it just provides a ton of utility having 2 of these units in your list, as it slows down your opponent or helps to draw them out. The last thing that I kind of skimmed over is the inclusion of 2 Hecaton land fortresses. So again, not too dissimilar from what we saw with the list that came in first place. And I think this is pretty interesting when you consider that you're basically paying the price of 2 Sagittars for a land fortress, and the land fortress is generally considered to be a more durable and stronger unit, but at the expense of not having scout and not being a transport. So I think it's an interesting trade-off, because we've actually 1-for-1 exchanged having 6 Sagittars to have 4 Sagittars and include that equivalent trade-off in terms of a land fortress. So we've exchanged 2 Sagittars, that would be 6, for a land fortress, now bringing your Sagittar count down to 4. So I do think it's an interesting choice that was made here, for all the same reasons I said in the previous list as well. But we also have the inclusion of a second land fortress here. So whereas the previous one was running a large brick of Hearthguard, we're actually foregoing that altogether, and we're instead running double trouble with the land fortresses, just being a menace on the table, really sturdy, really durable, tough to shift. It's just even harder for your opponent to try to shift these things off of objectives with access to armor contempt and cover. You also have some respectable shooting, so if you get both of these guys off, when someone does expose themselves to either deal with your forward pressure activations like the Berserks and the Sagittars, or your bikes that are pushing on the flanks, the land fortresses can come out and together in junction probably pick up whatever they're shooting at. Now, let's circle back a little bit to the character here being the Brokir Iron Master. Where is he going? What is he doing? Now, the Iron Master is an interesting choice because he's effectively acting as an engineer for this army. He is a free activation. We see this happen sometimes with people including like an E-Champ who sits in the home field objective, or in some cases even Uthar the Destined who acts as an action monkey. In this case, we have the Brokir Iron Master, who's far less durable than any one of those 2 options, has a lot less damage than those 2, but he does have some play in a list like this where you're trying to maximize the use of your vehicles. He provides a heal, and if you have your little guy alive still, the little robot who accompanies him, it's flat 3 healing per turn, which isn't insignificant. It does often take most armies a couple of activations, a couple of turns to take a land fortress down, and sometimes it's not uncommon that you'll have a Sagittar survive on 1 wound. So having a Brokir Iron Master nearby just helps ensure that it takes a little bit extra from your opponent. 1 or 2 more activations to try to kill whatever they're trying to put down, meaning that you get a few more turns of stalling their units from doing other things, either actions or killing as well. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about the Brokir Iron Master. I had a unit analysis video that came out about him recently. We don't really see this guy taking a whole bunch, but I definitely think it's an interesting archetype to explore and an interesting tech piece to include in certain lists. I know some people in our Discord server, which you could join free of charge using the link down in the description below, have been talking about the potential for including Brokir Iron Masters in their list, especially when they're talking about vehicles. The biggest drawback that I feel about this character is that unlike his Space Marine equivalent, he doesn't benefit from a lone op for being within 3 inches of a vehicle. What that effectively means is that you need to survive by just hiding. Now, maybe your opponent is going to have to make a calculated decision if they want to waste activations trying to kill a Brokir Iron Master when there are 2 land fortresses in their face. Maybe. But at the same time, it does mean that you're a lot more vulnerable if you're trying to actually get into position to keep your vehicles alive. ultimately, I think this is a very technical list. You don't have too many hammer units. Your durability is baked into 2 land fortresses because the bikes do die extremely quick. And so I think that to pilot this list effectively, you need to be extremely comfortable with it because it does have a high skill ceiling. So a little bit of a ramble, but I just kind of wanted to give you my unscripted thoughts about this list and how I think it all comes together. I think it has a lot of play. Obviously it does. It came second place and it's really interesting. It's a super unique design that we don't often see, including a double land fortress with several Sagittars as well. And I think we could confidently say by looking back at the scores that it does do what it aimed to do. You do get even games. In a lot of these instances, the scores are super tight, often resulting in a very slight win. The only list that this really struggled against was the Black Templar 100 Marine body list. And I think that's because it's a stat check. You need to be able to take down bricks of Marines. And if you don't have access to Hearthguard, I think that your ability to do that is significantly impacted. Then again, did anybody really expect to see 100 Black Templar Crusaders at the event? Probably not. It's a very unique list as well. But I think specifically in relation to this one that we're looking at right now, you're going to struggle because you get move blocked, you get bogged down, and they effectively just pin you down in your own base. You can't get anywhere. How are you going to navigate a land fortress around bricks and bricks of 20 Crusaders? It's just not feasible. It's not possible. So I think that that's just a hard counter. It's a big skew hard counter, and there's not much you could do about that, especially when you only have 2 bricks of bikes. Ultimately, though, I think the list really does accomplish what its goals were, and we see here that there are some very tight games across the board with some very nice victories for Alex. I'd love to hear a little bit more about this list. If Alex is by chance watching this video, please feel free to leave some comments down below if anybody has a little bit more insight as well. I'd love to learn a little bit more about it because it does seem like a really functional and fundamentally interesting list to play. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, if you haven't already, please do subscribe and leave a comment for me down below. Special thank you once again to Jordan and Saturn, our channel members, for helping me continue to make content for you guys to watch each week. If you're looking to buy some minis, please consider checking out our sponsored card brawlers and using my affiliate link down in the description below. For more Votann content, you can join our Discord using the link down in the description below as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.